if you haven't been following, if you have a life, in other words, and you haven't been following this in February, longtime strength and conditioning coach for Alabama, Scott Cochran, moves on. Kirby Smart hires him, not for strength and conditioning, but for a special teams role. Scott Cochran, I'll mention this when we get towards the end of this, has long sought an on-the-field coaching role. The man you're looking at right now, Nick Saban, has turned him down no less than 3 times seeking that role. Again, more on that in just a second. But a little light was shed on this, and a lot of what we have been telling you for a long time on this program was brought to light, and I think maybe because it was put in print instead of just on some channel on YouTube, then all of a sudden a lot of more folks buy into it. So just skimming through this, Cochran had become enamored with the idea of making the switch to being an on-field assistant. Check, been telling you that for about a year. Why Cochran ultimately did not end up at Ole Miss is a hot topic in the coaching world. Let you know more about that when I can. Regardless of what happened between Ole Miss and Cochran, it solidified in his mind when it was handled the way it was, he being Scott Cochran here, that it was time to move on. I want to pause right here and I want to let you know what that means. What it means is Scott Cochran was no longer going to be one of the strengths of Alabama football the way that he had been. And I'm not talking about from the standpoint of are his methods outdated, because I'm not qualified to break that down, nor in all likelihood are you. But what we see here is, and there's a quote, a very well-sourced quote in this piece from Zenitz and Talty, he made up his mind. I'm leaving. I'm done with the strength thing and dealing with Coach Saban. When someone is in one of the most pivotal roles in your organization and they're kind of referring to it as the strength thing, probably time for you to spin that wheel just as much as it's time for them to spin that wheel. We return to the quote. Once you do that, when the Ole Miss thing didn't happen, when you go back, you find all the problems magnified. You guys who are Alabama fans or maybe just college football fans have seen the rash of injuries in Tuscaloosa. Now, on this show, I thought it was kind of irresponsible to just hop on the wagon of saying, all right, well, 1 or 2 injuries could be a freak thing, but now there's a trend here, and, well, you can't deny the trend. What I didn't do is I didn't take the added step of saying, this is Scott Cochran's fault. Scott Cochran's methods are outdated, and whatever he's doing is tearing feet and ankles and knees up in Tuscaloosa. Well, I didn't do that. But you're high on bath salts if you don't think that Nick Saban didn't take a long, hard look at his program and the methodology. And if you've been in Tuscaloosa, Alabama recently, even before Scott Cochran moved on, there's always construction going on there. But most recently, they're building a big, fat new sports science center. Nick Saban made sure in his statement upon Cochran's exit to prominently mention it in that press release. That wasn't by accident. Nothing that guy does is by accident. I continue. The advice from Saban, once he learned that Cochran wanted to be an on-field guy, was to attend Alabama special teams meetings and invest time into learning the intricacies of the position. Cochran left upset. He thought he had already done that. Saban, meanwhile, had concerns about numbers and results from a strength and conditioning standpoint. He wanted tweaks made to the program. Sources said Saban began riding Cochran. At that point, Cochran even more determined to leave. Blah, blah, blah. You know how that ended. Here's what I want to tell you. When this happened, I went on the record here, I was in the minority, but I went on the record here as saying, I didn't really think it was a tsunami that was going to engulf the Alabama program. Now, here's what I will tell you, and this goes to the first point I want to make, is this is probably going to be a good thing for the University of Georgia. This isn't a zero-sum game. Personnel moves are not football games. Football's beautiful because you have a winner and you have a loser. That's competition. That's athletics. Sometimes in the personnel world, nobody wins. Sometimes both parties win. Sometimes you do have a winner and a loser, and sometimes you have varying degrees on either side of that fence. I told you, and I'll tell you again now, I believe both sides, when it's mid-November 2020 this year, I think Georgia's going to look at the early contributions that they're getting from Scott Cochran in the recruiting aspect and say, really glad we got that guy. And I think when the new guys that are on campus right now, guys like David Ballou, Matt Ray, names you probably don't know because they were tucked away in Indiana, but you will know when you start seeing them sink their teeth into and putting their thumbprint on the Alabama program in conjunction with basically the NASA center that they're building there from the sports science aspect. I think Alabama folks will look around and say, remember how much we panicked when Cochran left here? You know, as it turns out, we're doing okay here. It wasn't a crippling blow. What it was a perfect storm of a dead period, 2 brand names in Georgia and Alabama, and the need to generate conversation and clicks and what have you. So we didn't really buy into that. Here's what I will tell you, though. Nick Saban's key to a prolonged run of success at Alabama has always been adaptability. I want you to not even think about strength and conditioning. I want you to think for a second about offense. For anyone who questions, and I don't really think many people are, but for anyone who would question that guy Nick Saban's adaptable and probably the best in the game at it, could you imagine taking the 2009 Alabama team, marching them offensively into a film room, popping on tape of the 2019 Alabama team, in this hypothetical, we're able to draw film from the future, and have like Greg McElroy and Barrett Jones or whoever in the world was on campus, then have them watch the 2019 version of Alabama. Have Jim McElwain or Doug Nussmeier told that in a few years, Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian are going to be offensive coordinators here. Think about defensively, even as recently as 2011 or 2012, the way that Alabama won games, and then having Johnny Manziel and Nick Marshall make them look foolish, and having Nick Saban look at his own side of the ball where he specialized on defense and saying, we got to recruit a different athlete. And we got to develop them differently. And then all of a sudden you went from having a bunch of Dante Hightowers and Courtney Upshaws to Rashaan Evans, who is a freak and who in previous years will play safety probably for Alabama. And so Nick Saban's been adaptable with every aspect of his program. Why in the world would it be so crazy to assume that maybe even if Scott Cochran was staying there was about to be an overturning of several stones in search of regaining the stranglehold on the sport that they once had. And make no mistake about it, they recruited lights out, but what they did was they physically imposed their will on pretty much everyone they played. Alabama hasn't fallen off. They're still in the top tier of college football, but when you've seen them against Clemson, when you've seen them most recently against LSU, when you've seen them play Georgia, not only have they not appeared to be the far physically superior team, maybe in some of those cases they haven't been the physically superior team, period. That's not something they're comfortable with, and that's not something, when you have the resources that they do, limitless in supply, that's not something that they'll ever be comfortable with. But just some feedback that I was getting before Cochran ever left, as recently as, or as early as last year, there was a growing divide. I don't think I talked about it on the show, but there was a growing divide between the public fan perception of the value of Scott Cochran. This exists with a lot of strength and conditioning guys, by the way. They are high profile, more high profile now than they were in 2002. There was a growing divide between the value that people inside the industry and inside Alabama placed on him versus maybe the value that fans and media did. So when this happened, I knew what I was going to hear. I was going to see headline after headline that this is potentially a crushing blow to Alabama, and I knew I was going to look at the eye Josh here, and I was going to get text from people whose opinions I trust saying, oh man, it's going to sting, but watch what they do. And so I sat back and I said, good for Georgia. Probably not nightmarish for Alabama. And as it turns out, with the hires that they've made, mark my words, this time next year, this will be a distant memory, and folks will be looking for new low-hanging fruit to bash off the tree. But I think Georgia's going to be fine here, and I think Alabama's going to be fine. And I think that before too much longer, the names David Ballou and Matt Ray are going to be household items in the world of college football.